The United States has long positioned itself as a reliable global partner, but history tells a different story. Time and again, the US has turned its back on allies, often at the worst possible moment, whether for strategic advantage, political expediency, or sheer neglect. Some betrayals led to regime collapses, brutal massacres, or wars that could have been avoided. Here are 10 of the most shocking and disgraceful cases where America abandoned its supposed friends, leaving them to fend for themselves in dire circumstances. Number 1. The sudden cancellation of Lend-Lease to the Soviet Union. During World War II, the US provided critical aid to its allies through the Lend-Lease Act, 1941, sending weapons, vehicles, food, and fuel worth over $50 billion, equivalent to nearly $750 billion today. The Soviet Union, in particular, relied on American trucks, aircraft, and industrial materials to sustain its war effort against Nazi Germany. But just 3 days after Germany's surrender, on May 11, 1945, President Harry Truman abruptly cancelled all Lend-Lease shipments to the USSR. Even cargo already en route was ordered to turn back. Moscow had expected continued support for post-war reconstruction, but instead, the US demanded full payment for any remaining goods, amounting to $1.3 billion, a price the Soviet Union refused to pay. This betrayal stunned the Kremlin and was one of the first clear signs of the coming Cold War. While the US launched the Marshall Plan to rebuild Western Europe, the USSR was economically strangled instead of supported. Stalin saw this as a deliberate move to weaken the Soviet Union, fueling the arms race and hostility between the two superpowers. Number 2. The abandonment of South Vietnam. After fighting a brutal war to prevent communist expansion, the US abruptly cut off military support to South Vietnam, sealing its fate. From 1965 to 1973, the US spent over $120 billion on the war, deployed over 500,000 troops, and suffered over 58,000 American deaths. South Vietnam relied heavily on American weapons and air support. Yet in 1973, after signing the Paris Peace Accords, the US withdrew, promising continued financial and military aid. When North Vietnam launched a full-scale invasion in early 1975, desperate South Vietnamese leaders begged Washington for help. Congress refused. Even as Saigon collapsed in April 1975, the US evacuated its own personnel but left thousands of South Vietnamese allies behind. Many were executed or sent to brutal re-education camps. The infamous helicopter evacuation from the US Embassy roof symbolized the ultimate betrayal of an ally who had trusted America's word. Number 3. The US encourages the 1956 Hungarian Uprising, then does nothing. In October 1956, Hungarians rose up against Soviet rule, inspired by American rhetoric promising support for anti-communist movements. Radio Free Europe broadcasts, funded by the US, encouraged Hungarians to fight for their freedom, implying US military intervention was possible. However, when Soviet tanks rolled into Budapest, President Dwight Eisenhower did nothing. The West watched as thousands of Hungarian rebels were crushed, executed, or sent to gulags. America's inaction shattered the hopes of Eastern European resistance movements and sent a clear message: the US would not risk war with the USSR, no matter how much it had promised support. Number 4. The Kurds, betrayed again and again. Few groups have been betrayed by the US as consistently as the Kurds. In 1975, the US encouraged Kurdish rebels to fight against Iraq, only to cut off support when Iran made peace with Saddam Hussein. This left the Kurds vulnerable to Iraqi forces, leading to thousands of deaths. Henry Kissinger infamously remarked, "Covert action should not be confused with missionary work." In 1991, after the Gulf War, President George H.W. Bush urged Iraqi Kurds to rebel against Saddam Hussein, only for the US to stand by as Saddam's forces massacred thousands. In 2019, after partnering with the Syrian Kurds to defeat ISIS, President Donald Trump abruptly withdrew US troops from northern Syria, allowing Turkey to launch an invasion that killed thousands and displaced over 200,000 Kurds. Once again, the Kurds learned the hard way that American promises meant little. Number 5. The Bay of Pigs disaster. The Bay of Pigs invasion was one of the most humiliating and scandalous U.S. betrayals of its allies. It involved 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, who attempted to overthrow Fidel Castro. These exiles, mostly anti-communist Cubans who had fled Castro's regime, were led to believe that their invasion would receive full U.S. military support, including air cover. However, after initial airstrikes on April 15, President John F. Kennedy abruptly canceled further air support, fearing international backlash and potential Soviet retaliation. When the invasion force landed at Playa Girón on April 17, 1961, they were immediately overwhelmed by Castro's forces. Without American backup, the operation turned into a disaster. Over 100 exiles were killed, and 1,189 were captured. Many were imprisoned for years, while others were executed. The failed invasion strengthened Castro's rule and pushed Cuba closer to the Soviet Union, ultimately leading to the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, bringing the world to the brink of nuclear war. The Bay of Pigs betrayal remains a dark stain on U.S. foreign policy, showcasing how Washington was willing to sacrifice its allies to avoid political embarrassment. Number 6. The Shah of Iran, America's disposable dictator. For over 3 decades, the U.S. propped up Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, seeing him as a key ally in the Middle East. His regime received billions in American military aid, and in return, the Shah kept Iran firmly in the Western camp, allowing U.S. access to oil and serving as a counterweight to Soviet influence. However, his rule was brutally repressive. The Savak, his secret police, tortured and killed political opponents, leading to widespread unrest. By 1978, protests against the Shah intensified, with millions demanding his removal. The U.S., fearing instability, initially supported him but quickly distanced itself when it became clear his rule was collapsing. In January 1979, the Shah fled Iran, seeking refuge in several countries. When he arrived in the U.S. for medical treatment, Iran's new leader, Ayatollah Khomeini, demanded his extradition. The U.S. refused, further escalating tensions. Soon after, in November 1979, Iranian militants stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, taking 52 American hostages for 444 days. The betrayal of the Shah, once America's most loyal ally in the Middle East, led to the rise of an anti-American Islamic Republic and decades of hostility between Iran and the U.S. Number 7. The betrayal of Chiang Kai-shek. During World War II, the U.S. strongly supported Chiang Kai-shek and his Chinese nationalist government, Kuomintang, KMT, in its fight against both Imperial Japan and Mao Zedong's communist forces. Billions in military aid and weapons were sent to Chiang's forces. However, when the war ended, the U.S. gradually began withdrawing support, viewing the corrupt and ineffective KMT as a losing cause. By 1949, Mao's Communist Army had gained the upper hand in the Chinese Civil War. Washington cut off military aid to Chiang, effectively sealing his fate. Forced to retreat, Chiang and the remnants of his government fled to Taiwan, where they established the Republic of China. In 1979, the betrayal was completed when the U.S. formally switched its recognition from Taiwan to Communist China, effectively isolating Taiwan on the world stage. The island, once a key U.S. ally, was left in diplomatic limbo, a situation that persists to this day. Number 8. The U.S. abandons Afghanistan twice. The U.S. abandoned Afghanistan not once, but twice, leading to catastrophic consequences each time. In the 1980s, the U.S. armed and funded the Mujahideen to fight the Soviet Union, pouring billions into the resistance. However, after the Soviets withdrew in 1989, the U.S. abruptly ended support, leaving Afghanistan in chaos. A brutal civil war ensued, and by 1996, the Taliban seized power, creating a radical Islamic regime that later harbored Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, leading to the 9/11 attacks. In 2021, history repeated itself when President Joe Biden ordered a sudden withdrawal of U.S. troops. Within days, the Afghan government collapsed, and the Taliban retook power. The chaotic evacuation from Kabul airport, where desperate Afghans clung to U.S. planes, became a symbol of America's betrayal of its Afghan allies, including interpreters and military personnel who had risked their lives for 2 decades. Number 9. Betraying the Montagnards of Vietnam. The Montagnards, indigenous Highlanders in Vietnam, were among the most loyal U.S. allies during the Vietnam War. They fought alongside U.S. Special Forces, providing crucial intelligence and engaging in some of the war's fiercest battles against the Viet Cong. But after the U.S. withdrawal in 1975, the Montagnards were abandoned. The new communist government of Vietnam saw them as traitors, unleashing brutal repression. Thousands were executed, imprisoned, or sent to labor camps, while their land was confiscated. Despite their sacrifice, only a fraction were evacuated to the U.S., and even those who made it struggled to gain recognition for their service. Number 10. The Abandonment of Iraqi Translators. During the Iraq War, thousands of Iraqi translators and workers risked their lives working for the U.S. military. Many were promised special immigrant visas, SIVs, to move to the U.S. in exchange for their service. However, after the war, the visa process slowed dramatically. By 2021, tens of thousands were still waiting for approval, while many were hunted down by insurgents as collaborators. Some were executed, while others were forced to flee into hiding. One interpreter, Johnny Walker, later said, "We were disposable assets." The U.S. government's failure to protect those who aided its war effort remains a lasting stain on its reputation.